Hello, good evening. As Simon introduced, I'm Derek. I am going to give a talk titled What's New in PHP 8. If you have any questions, please use the question and answer tab that you can find in the Zoom webinar. It's in the bottom near the chat that some of you have found already. And I'll try to keep an eye on that during the talk, because I think it is better to have at least some interaction going on instead of just me looking at a camera and talking into it, which for doing for 50 minutes gets sort of boring after a while. Excuse me. Okay, let me focus, right, and there we go. So hi, I'm Derick. I'm European, it's a long story, live in London. I'm PHP 7.4's release manager. That pretty much means every 2 weeks I need to package something. It doesn't really do a lot more. But it's an interesting way of contributing to the PHP project, which I've been doing for a long time now. I write this tool that you might have heard of called Xdebug on PHP's daytime support. I host a podcast where I talk about all the new features that's going to make it into PHP, or perhaps not. I like maps, I like beer, cheers, and I like whiskey, and some of these things will come back in some of my examples. Without further ado, let's start with something that isn't actually immediately new in PHP 8, but is already there in PHP 7.4, just as an illustration what we're going to build on top of that. So I have a class called Whiskey. I like using emojis in my class names because that makes it really hard to write code. I don't know, please don't do this. And in PHP 7.4, what we introduced is typed properties, right? So we've integer, distilleries and bottlers and stuff and so on. This is nothing new. This is new in 7.4, which you can also do on static properties. You can have default values, and you can even have more on the same line. This is nothing new. I'm just showing you this because this is a way that PHP has been taking since the PHP 7.0 days, right? PHP has been adding more and more type information to its internal language that you then can use to write more descriptive and hopefully better and safer code. So one of the big things that came in PHP 7.4 is this extra thing with types. Like before PHP 7.4, if you inherited a method, it had to match the exact same signature, otherwise you'd get a fatal error. Now in PHP 7.4 already, you can have something called contravariant argument types, meaning that an inherited method could accept a wider type than the parent method. So in this case, we have a pig, and we have the class boar extends a pig. Now, if Asterix only hunts boars, the goals could hunt potentially more than just boars and also pigs. So this is a wider type. So arguments can accept a broader type, and still every method that was written against the original hunt class would still work, except that you can also make use of this extra type in the inherited class. This is called contravariance. Now, why this is important, I'll come back to in a moment. Now, PHP 7.4 and earlier, we started introducing static or scalar type hints. Or type hints is no longer the right word for it. Let's just call them types from now on, or type definitions. And that meant that if you had a class number, for example, and you wanted to store a number in it, well, you could make it an integer, for example, or you could make it a floating point number. But if you want to be able to store an integer or a floating point number, you had to result on doing this, right? The integers and floats, you could only pick one of them instead of in front of your property names, and you can't have both. And same thing, you can't do int or float as a number in the setNumber method or as a return type. And there's lots of tools that make use of this, including PHP Stan and so on, to still enforce some of this. But the language itself didn't support anything of this. Now, PHP extends its property support and its return argument types and its return argument types. That makes no sense. Its return types and its argument types, but also allowing to do a union type. So you can now say int or float and the PHP engine will actually enforce that for you. And in the case of int and float, you can pass either in and it will work just fine, which is, I think, a useful addition to it. Now, PHP internally makes quite a lot of use of this already anyway, like functions like microtime, actually depending on whether you give it a true as an argument or not, will return a string or a float. But this was never something that we could encode in PHP. So the reflection information that we had available for functions could never say anything. It always had to show mixed, for example, or rather it didn't have any defined, so it wouldn't say anything. So this is a pattern that happens quite a lot internally in PHP already. And this is now something that can be exposed, and pretty much all the internal weird types that PHP does, not all of them, is now possible to actually define in your language in your definitions. And for PHP's internal functions, we have done exactly that, allowing for much better error messages when you pass in broken data, really. So the union types on their own also allow PHP internals to also enforce these types, where that wasn't really done in a similar way as in the code that you write yourself in PHP 7.4 and earlier. It's also now possible to have a trailing comma in function definitions, which I think makes more sense now, because if the function definitions with a list of arguments are getting more complicated with more data in it, having the comma at the end actually sort of makes sense. Minor detail aside. All right, now the types, the union types let me phrase this better. Union types will also conform with coercive typing mode in pretty much the exact same ways as what you would expect if it was just a single type, except that there are multiple types now. And actually, it will use a specific preference, and you can walk through these examples later on, Jan, to make sure that the bestest type is actually picked. It makes sense if you look at this and go through all of the argument, all of the specific lines. I shall not do that because we go to run out of time if I do that. Now, one extra type is introduced in PHP, which is called mixed. And mixed is the only named union type that PHP 8 has. And mixed is the union of array, bool, callable, int, float, null, object, resource, or string, but not null. Sorry, null is in there, but not nothing is the important thing here. Now, why is mixed useful? Well, mixed is useful because sometimes when you go over your code to upgrade it for something that hasn't had the types added, if you need to have a complicated data type that you couldn't do with a simple union type, because it literally can expect anything, what you don't really want to do is for your arguments, your return type specifies array or bool or callable or int or float and so on, right? So the mixed keyword acts as like a shoehorn in here that basically tells the person that reads the codes saying, well, we have looked at what types are supported here, but it really accepts anything. In comparison to it, we haven't looked at this upgrading it. So that's kind of where mixed is used. But mixed acts as an internal union type, and it also will follow the standard variant rules. And if there is no return type declaration on a function, then that will be assumed to be mixed or void, which means that mixed is not compatible with that directly. Now, union types at the moment cannot be given your own special names. You have to specify them all in turn. Maybe in the future, it will be possible to create your own union type. Say you can do number equals int or float, but PHP 8.0 does not have that yet. All right, so let's go back to constructor properties. Now, if you have a class that needs to define the following properties, it has a name, it has a distillery, it has an age, as an integer, and it might have a specific bottler set to it. Now, if you would want to create a class where in the constructor, you also need to make these things, what you pretty much have to implement is the following, right? You need to define all your properties with all your types. You need to create a constructor where you accept an argument and define the type so that you can enforce it here on constructor. And then you need to this name equals name for every single parameter that you pass into a method. And this is a lot of boilerplate that you see a lot in model classes where you really don't particularly care about any functions or any methods that you have on a class. So pretty much all of your class makes up is this big boilerplate thing that's kind of frankly annoying to write. Now I know that some IDEs help you with this, but I mean in plain code this is annoying. Well, PHP 8 helps you with this by allowing you to specify the visibility in the argument definition of the constructor. So for example, you can say public string name. And this is equivalent to defining a public property's name defined as a string, as well as accepting it in a constructor, but also the assignment of doing this name equals name. So all of the boilerplate code from here can now pretty much be replaced by the following. Now, this is syntax that has been copied from Hack that already had it. I mean, you can argue about syntax, which we do on a PHP mailing list quite a lot. But this is what it turned out to be. Yeah. So I quite like the idea of constructor property promotion, especially in those model classes that, that you end up writing a lot. And of course, don't forget, you can use the training comma here again too. Now, to build on top of this, you can, of course, have default values to these things. I've removed the types here now, but I've had classes or settings classes where, for example, to list all the whiskeys that I have, do I want to include a distillery name? Do I want to include a description? Do I want to include a tasting notes? What is the page size that I want to use and what I want to sort by, in this case, whiskey as default? Now, if you create a settings object here and you specify information for the first three things, like include this distillery, description, and tasting notes, if you do new settings, false, true, false, if you see this code, you see false, true, false, and you absolutely have no idea what this actually means. Similarly, if you want to sort by something else than a whiskey, you're going to have to specify the arguments for all of the other arguments, so the values of all of the other arguments as well, just to be able to sort the sorting from whiskey to rating, which is also really quite annoying. PHP 8 helps you with this by allowing for named arguments as arguments to constructors and methods as well as functions. So in this case, if we want to take all the default settings like this, then we can suddenly now say, I don't know what all the other settings are, but you can just set include distillery to false and it will then not include it. And similarly, if you want to sort just by something else and don't want to override any of the other default values, you can just specify the name and for rating. Now, I think I think this is actually useful for specifically this case. For other cases, I think you need to be really careful with this because if you do inheritance, PHP doesn't enforce that the inherited names are the same as in the parent class. That is kind of, well, it is how it is. It was difficult to implement. That also means that if as a library author you change the name of your variables or your arguments to your functions, then people that use that function now need to also take care of the names changing as arguments. So although I think named arguments are useful, they are specifically useful in this case, where you have a bunch of things that are otherwise hard to see what it is. And as people in the chat say, yeah, absolutely, the variable names become part of your formal API, which means that, in my opinion, if you write an open source project and you expect other people to use your APIs, for PHP 8, you can do two things. You can say, as well, to your user saying, we don't care what our variable names are. We do not want you to use named arguments. Or what you can do is you can decide, well, we need to make sure that all our argument names make sense. And now is going to be the time to name them in such a way that they make sense for our users. We've been doing that for PHP internal functions itself. It is a lot of work because PHP has a lot of functions, and you also want to make sure that the names are similar between different extensions. Like if you call it DB in MySQL, you don't want to call it database in PostgreSQL, for example, right? And going through that takes some time, and I don't think we are 100% done yet, not even in the first release candidate that came out of PHP 8 not long ago. But yeah, be careful with this. I think this makes sense for specific cases. I would never use this for any method call that I'm making, because, well, you also have to type the names, right? And if it's obvious what a function does, like if you have a sort function, it will take the name of your column, for example, and that's it, right? You don't need to specify column, colon, and then the name of the column. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, we've seen attributes a little bit. So there's a question in the chat about the default arguments. So if you have settings here now, the question is, can I just use commas instead of specifying the default values? And that isn't something that PHP does, because that probably makes it even more, it makes it harder to see what's going on, because not only do you now no longer know what the values are, you also need to take very clear care about what the position of your arguments is. And the difference between a single comma and a double comma, or 3 commas and 4 commas, is really hard to see. So this isn't something that PHP supports. Instead, this is something that you just have to do yourself. So either use the names or well, specify all the values. We've seen attributes already when in my example where I had a union type between int and float. This is a standard way of how many tools do this, how PHP Documenter does this, how ORMs do this, to say, well, the type of this column is a string and it is our ID column, for example. But this information here is not something that PHP internally does something with at all. The only thing it takes care of is makes this comment, this doc block comment, available to the reflection API. But it doesn't care what's in there, which makes it really hard to use sometimes, because you need to have a specific tool that knows this specific syntax. And different tools implement the syntax in a slightly different way or attach a different meaning to it. With PHP 8, there is now something called an attribute. And attributes are things that are parsed by the PHP engine and are attached to reflection information for these attributes or for these elements. So the class distillery gets associated with the entity, the attribute doctrine /ORM /attribute /entity. This is a class name. And because it's a class name, it will adhere to your namespace definitions. The interesting thing is that this is not only a class name, it also accepts arguments. And this is arguments as like they would be for a constructor. So this is how you define these attributes. They are defined, they are parsed by the PHP engine, and the reflection API has methodology and functionality to actually enforce that these are things that actually can be parsed. So the reflection API can actually be used to make sure that you don't misspell attribute names, for example. So yeah, as I said, we have the class name here and then the constructor arguments. Now, how would I use this? Now, in order to read attributes is something that you need to use the reflection API for. So what I have in this example here is that the first snippet is I have a class distillery, and I say that my private property name is a string type column. In this case, I use my ORM attributes /column as my attribute name. Now, in order for the reflection API to do something useful with that, you actually have to create a class with that name. So you need to create a class in the namespace myORM_attributes with the class column. And not only that, you need to define this class itself as an attribute with the attribute. I know that's the word attribute lots of times in a single sentence. But as long as your attributes are defined as attributes, the reflection API will be able to deal with this. So in order to find all the attributes for the name property, so that is this name property, we create a reflection API object for the class. We get the property name, and that then contains the definition for the name property. When we call get attributes on it, that returns all the attributes in order. So you get the attribute name. And then you can also ask for the arguments to this attribute. So if you call this get arguments, we should get back string in this case. But the cool thing comes here. When you call new instance on this reflection attribute definition, it will actually create this column class and pass in the argument that you specified here to the constructor. And in this moment, of course, if the class can't be instantiated, you know that you've misspelled something. Or the constructor could enforce that you can only pass in real types such as string or int. And if you misspelled it with srting, it could throw an exception. So you can very much more descriptively describe your metadata for your properties, for your functions, for your arguments, for your classes. And I forgot one, there's 5 classes, but I don't remember the 5th one. The attributes implementation was decided on pretty quickly, but then the PHP internal team spent months arguing about which syntax to pick, but we finally landed on the add with scrap brackets in like the 5th vote we had on this. I quite like them, but I think most people that make really use of the technology behind this are going to be your ORMs or your frameworks that do something with its attributes, but of course you can also use them yourself through reflection. Yes, just to show the output of this script here is that we get a name my attributes column, which is my attributes column. We get the arguments here, that is this var, this line here, showing that shows strings. And if you do new instance, you'll see that we have this new attributes column object with the type specified here. And of course, I use the Constructor Property Promotion so that we actually have a defined property call type to accept our string argument. So that's attributes. As Christoph says, yes, attributes everywhere. As I already mentioned, this is there's actually a question here. Catherine is asking, if the attribute class doesn't exist, when will the error occur? The error will only occur if you call new instance. But before that, never this is nowhere validated. So I think most stricter tools such as ORMs and frameworks will make use of new instance. But if you don't care and you want to still introspect your attributes, you don't have to call new instance. So you don't have to create this object class if you don't want to do the extra checking. That choice is up to you. But by allowing you as a user to have this choice, you can either use this to its fullest extent or in a much more lightweight way where it can also be useful, of course. All right, so use case I've said already, you can use them to replace PHP doc annotations in Doctrine or Symfony, or perhaps in the future in things like PHP Stan or Psalm. I don't think they have implemented anything like that yet. And it is also possible that PHP itself gets internal attributes such as a deprecated annotation or a hint to PHP's JIT engine, I'll get back to that in a moment, to very specifically JIT this specific function or not JIT another function. I see there are a few more questions about attributes, so I'll go answer this as well. So Lila is asking, or Lila, sorry, don't quite know how to pronounce your name, is asking, are attributes evaluated by tools like static analyzers and code coverage tools? At the moment, there aren't yet, because almost no tools are finished with PHP 8 support, but I can absolutely expect that to happen in the future. Things like Psalm and PHP Stan already use annotations, and I very much would understand that I would also start supporting the PHP 8 attributes as we currently have. And for code coverage tools, I know that PHP Unit uses attributes to sometimes disable coverage for a specific function. I can also imagine that will also start to support PHP 8 attributes, but I'm not quite sure whether I actually have implemented that. Okay, there's one more question. Christoph is asking, is it possible to pass an instance of an object as an argument of an attribute? For example, blah, 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 something. No, at the moment, this is not possible, because the same things you can use as arguments here are the same things that you can use as default values to constructor arguments. And you can't use new foo as a default constructor argument. So that is the same restriction applies there. Anything you can do as default values in an argument to a method or a constructor is something you'd be able to pass as arguments to your attribute at the moment. I think in the future, and some people are talking about nested attributes, but that hasn't been implemented for PHP 8 yet. All right, the next thing is match expressions. How many times had you had to write something code like this, right? Will, if you have a switch statement, I see a question, Catherine, I'll answer it later after I've gone through the rest of the presentation. So switch sometimes can be quite cumbersome, right? If depending on a value of something, in this case, this Lexer look ahead type, you need to set the statement variable to the output of a method call. You need to implement this in such a way, right? So you need to, if it's tselect, set statement to this. If it's update, set statement to update statement, and so on and so on. And this gets kind of cumbersome. And there's another issue with switchers, that switch matches not on a strict comparison-wise, but it does in this equally comparison-wise. So switch uses equals equals and not equals equals equals. So it is equal and not identical is what switch does. And that can also sometimes cause some issues as well. PHP 8 introduces a new keyword called match. And match is a switch, but done in a different way. So match returns a value. And it returns the value of the clause that matches it. So instead of a case, we have here just a single expression. And in this case, what it does is compares the value of this expression with this expression. And of course, at the moment, this expression is a constant. So basically this says if this value is Lexer tselect, make statements be the value of this expression. So this is a shortcut way of doing the assignment and a comparison, and this match also happens in the identical fashion, so equals equals equals. At the moment, on the left-hand side, you can specify a expression. On the right-hand side, you can also specify one expression. So you can't have multiple statements here, just like you can't have multiple statements in our short lambda function, which is the one with the fn keyword. So the same sort of restrictions apply here. Also, an interesting thing is that if nothing matches, and of course in the case with default, default will always match if tselect, tupdate, or delete doesn't match. You will actually get an exception telling you that you forgot to select for something. So Ruth's asking, is it possible to have a void expression on the right-hand side of match? You mean here on this side where I have this select statement? You can't have void there, but you can, of course, have null there. Yeah, you need to return something, and void is something that is nothing, so you can't return it, but you can return null. You can't leave this part out. And I don't actually know whether you can just use a comma to chain them together. I will have to check that if that's what you're asking about. So this is kind of handy. So switches an expression, so returns this value. Match doesn't do type juggling, which is also really useful. There's also no automatic fall through, so you don't have to take care of your break statements or forgetting about your break statements. And as I mentioned, there will be an exception if nothing matched. Yeah, I am quite a fan of this match expression as well. And there's plenty of projects where I can already make use of this. But sadly, my host hasn't upgraded to PHP 8 yet. But that's OK. I'm my own host. All right, let's move on to a few other things here. Now, sometimes you have to deal with nested data structures where you don't know whether previous one is null. So in this case, if you want to get the country out of a data structure, you have to first check if our standard variable session equals null. If it is not null, then we can access the user property of session. If the user property is not null, then we can call getAddress on the user. And then if the address isn't null, we can access the country. And this gets really cumbersome, especially, well, if the chain is even longer than this. PHP 8 introduces the Null-safe Operator, which is the question mark dash greater than sign. Sorry, explaining how the different characters are called is kind of tricky. But that basically does all of this checking for you. So country is guaranteed to always have a value or be null. Nothing in here can ever be accessed on a null object or an array, or can a method be called on a null object? Because this works as follows. What this chain does is like, if session is null, it returns null. If session user is null, country will be null. If session user getAddress returns null, country will be null. And only if they're all not null will country be accessed. So this is a way how you can go into this data structure and not having to care about null or not. Yeah, I like some of the names that people come up with, like checked arrow or Christmas tree. I like Christmas tree. I think that's going to stick with me from now on. And that makes a lot of sense, right? And this is a chain. The chain is important here. So even, yeah, just to bring this out again in a different slide with a slightly more complicated example where getAddress also accepts a argument here, which is the format optional session, or sorry, the format property of session. If session format is null, null is passed to getAddress. That is the first thing that happens because all the arguments evaluated first. Then if session user equals null, getAddress will never be called. So you can never call a method on a null property or variable. Same thing is if getAddress returns null, country returns null. So this is a really nice, good way of dealing with this kind of data structure. I understand that this isn't something that you use in many situations, but it is kind of useful to have in the cases where this makes sense. All right, let's move on to some more goodies. In PHP 7.4, somebody wanted to introduce a new string function that check whether a string contains another string, whether a string starts with something or a string ends with something. And it did for each of these variants, it also did a multi-byte variant and a case-insensitive variant. And PHP 7.4 that didn't get passed because there are just too many functions. The same RFC author tried again for PHP 8 with just a subset of this, and that accumulated in the string contains, the string starts with, and the string ends with methods. These are not multi-byte variants, so will work with UTF-8, and are just a really quick way of doing a string contains or a string starts with and an ends with instead of having to use strpls and substring to do that kind of matching. It's just a nice, quick way of doing that. And yes, they are all the same, doing haystack needle, like most functions in PHP actually does, except for array search and in array, if it's array function, that is. All right, moving on to more features. I only have this memory done because I've given this talk a few times before. PHP 7.4 introduced something called, what was it called? A weak reference. And a weak reference is pretty much a way for making sure that you can point to an object, but not prevent PHP's memory from freeing that object if it isn't used in other places. That is a theoretical explanation. I think we should explain this with an example that I have here instead. Like, in this case, we have a class called new standard class. If map was a normal array, what would happen is that if you do map objects, and we set data for object, which is some, pretend this is some big array of metadata for it. This pretty much meant that because object was referenced here, if you do unset object, PHP's memory manager couldn't free up this data because it's still referenced through something else. Now, with a weak map, this is no longer the case. A weak map allows you to use a object as a key into a data structure, the weak map data structure, and store metadata with this. And this is something that ORMs do quite a lot. And unlike normal referencers, or not reference, but normal PHP's memory manager, if you unset object, the object automatically gets removed from the weak map as well, and the metadata gets removed, which is really handy to do because it allows you to implement some caching, but don't keep the cache around if the object itself also disappears. So if we have this use case where we have this, this calls our foobar caching mechanism, we have this weak map cache thing. If we call from our class get something with caching, passing our data structure, in this case, say it is our a data structure representing a row in a database, then it can calculate, then it will only call our complicated compute something expensive method if it doesn't exist in the cache yet. Okay, so let me go over this once more. If you call this function once, you call get something with caching and you specify your, say, your user object. Well, for the user object, you want to know that what the column types are and so on and so on. And that is because it requires introspecting information that your database provides. That is actually kind of expensive to do. So you don't really want to do this every single time when you want to see or iterate over what kind of columns make up your user object, for example. Now, what this line does here is that if in the cache we have null, sorry, let me rephrase this. If we have our object part of our cache, then it will just return this. And if it doesn't return it, it will then do this complex calculation to create a metadata for our user object. So going to the database and fetching all the column types and so on and so on. Now, without a weak map, you can't do this because pretending that this was a normal array, if you would do this, then because this class would still exist in memory, if you would free your user object, or if your user object goes out of scope, you don't need it anymore, it would still be referenced in this cache array, and hence the PHP memory manager can no longer free this. Making this a workable addition to ORMs for making sure that they use less memory without having to go to complex hoops where they create back references to make sure that these things are removed from the cache when the object goes out of scope through, for example, a destructor. Hopefully that made a bit more sense than my original explanation. All right, moving on to the next one. The PHP development team has started changing lots of warnings and notices to exceptions, but only in the cases where they are guaranteed to be a programmer error. As an example, the array fill function in PHP, you can give it a starting index and then a number, the amount of elements that you want to create, and then you get the value that you want to create multiple of. Now, if you would do the array fill 0 minus 100, minus 100 elements make no sense. So in PHP 7.4, you get a warning for this saying the number of elements can't be negative. In PHP 8, because array fill can never have a negative number, this is a programming error, you will now get a value exception saying that the argument to the number must be greater than or equal to 0. So in this kind of situations, and about a few dozen more, PHP will now throw you a value exception for programming errors like this. But it won't do it for the situations where it is user input, because you don't want, or not user input, but variable data. Like it won't do it for mix, for example. It would never do it for that, first of all, because it makes no sense for mix, but because that is not going to be a program error. And in that case, you will still need a, you'll still get a warning. So Steve's asking, under the incognito name Lila, do you think there might be a new PSR for weak maps? I'm not sure whether there will be a PSR for it, because this is something that is built into the language, and I don't see how a PSR can specifically help here. If you have a good idea about it, I'm happy to hear about that later. Okay, any further questions about this value to exception conversion? Nope, I'll move on then. Now, in some cases, especially in unit tests, sometimes you want to catch an exception, but you don't really care about the exception itself. In this case, if you have a permission exception, the only thing you might want to do is to log, you don't have permission to do this, and you don't need to get any other information in here, for example. Now in PHP 8, you can simply leave out the variable name, and then the exception itself would not be called. Right, that's this feature, and there's nothing much to it. Sorry. Now, so far, I've gone through many of PHP's 8 functions, but I haven't mentioned the JIT engine yet. And many people say that PHP's 8's greatest feature is the just-in-time compiler, because it's going to make everything so much faster. Now, I am sorry to have you to burst your bubble there. The JIT engine in PHP adds an extra step to how PHP goes from your code to executing it. So traditionally, the steps that PHP has is we parse the script, we look at what words are in there, we analyze all the words to make function definitions and class definitions, and then PHP will convert that to something called bytecode. And bytecode, that is something that PHP's interpreter can run to then execute your code. But this interpreter stage needs to do that for every single time something needs to be executed. And the interpreted stage, although PHP has a pretty fast interpreter, it isn't quite native to what you could run when, for example, you would write a program in C and compile that C program to a binary that you can run on your platform. What PHP's just-in-time compiler does, it adds this extra step so that if specific code is run on the interpreter a lot of times, it will then compile this behind the scenes to machine code, and then will run that machine code directly on your CPU without having to go to your interpreter all the time. And that works great for functions that don't call any other functions and are maths heavy. Now, most PHP applications don't really have that kind of issues in there in a way. So hence, I think, although the just-in-time engine will give you some performance boost for these heavy computational functions, as long as they don't call other functions, in most cases, I don't think you're going to see more than 2 or 3% or maybe 5% performance increase. And sometimes you might see a performance decrease. Now, what also comes with the just-in-time compilation is that there's also an extra state in PHP that also need to be maintained, enhancing the complexity of the PHP engine quite a lot. And that isn't something that can be useful if you need to debug something, because the bug can either be in the interpreter or now in the JIT engine. And from what I've been seeing of people reporting bugs with PHP JIT, there seem to be also very hard to reproduce. And if you can't reproduce them, you can't fix them. So Ruth's asking in chat, have the PHP devs ever considered saving the bytecode in the same way that Python does? And if so, why isn't this a thing now? So PHP's opcache cache that you can use for saving the bytecode in memory, so PHP doesn't have to do the parsing and the analyzing state anymore. Opcache stores all the bytecode in memory specific to a specific platform. Now, you can configure opcache to also store this information in a file on disk. The difference between Python there is that in PHP, this code is going to be specific for the machine where it is run on, because it contains paths, it knows about the endianness, it knows about whether you're on 32-bit and 64-bit, or many other internal PHP flags that are going to depend on your execution performance, whether you have a debugger loaded, what flags for opcache are, and so on and so on. So although PHP's opcache can store these files, they're not going to be as useful as they would be in Python, whereas in Python, there should be platform independent mostly, and you can ship them somewhere else, but that isn't something that the PHP engine supports or likely will support in the future either, because I don't think there is particularly much need for it. Ruth's also asking that the JIT engine is for x68, sorry, not 68, 86. What I particularly mean there, it's the 64-bit Intel architecture, sorry, the AMD 64 architecture that this is implemented for. It's implemented for Mac, Windows, and Linux, but there's currently no JIT implemented for example, the ARM64 platform. Whether this will come in the future, it is possible, but I'm not sure what the plans there are. It might not even be worthwhile doing so. But if it is, and people have time to implement this, I'm sure it will be. But because this is a totally different architecture and this compilation state from interpreted code to binary code is so going to be dependent on the architecture that you pretty much need to redo all the effort. And that, of course, creates more maintainability, more things to maintain for the PHP developers. All right. Now, the big question, of course, is when is PHP 8 out? Well, the word is November 26th, hopefully. At the moment, it still looks like we're going there. The release looks pretty good. There is some issues in the JIT engine, and I'm sure more bugs will be found in the JIT engine even after PHP 8.0 comes out. In order to prevent that, what you can do is test the release candidates, test the betas, go through your application to make sure that all your arguments have the right names, that it runs with PHP 8, that you don't get called out on some gotchas that do exist, except there are not very many. But I'm sure there will be some cases where your script won't or your application won't run directly on PHP 7.4. And of course, it's all going to depend a little bit on what the community does with composer libraries that people are using. But I see quite a lot of work being put on there people making sure everything is ready when PHP comes out in about 6 weeks' time. So code testing is what I have to say. I see there's a few more questions. So let me go through all of these. And because I don't have any more slides except for a few here, is like, if you want to know more about what happens in PHP's internals, go to listen to my podcast called PHP Internals.news. If development is happening, there will be an episode out every week. At the moment, we are in feature free, so nothing much is happening. So there won't be any episodes until the PHP 8 release episode, which I'll hope to get out in the same day as the PHP 8 release in November 26, to talk about the new features a little bit and talk about the things that didn't make it in there. All right, let's now go to some questions. So I move adjust to my face, put the questions here so I can read the questions and still look at you at the same time. All right, there's one question by Steve, I think, still in the Incognito Lila, is asking, if I add attributes to a open source package, will it completely die in PHP 7? Actually, it won't. The interesting thing is that the add operator is already the shut up operator, and it is valid syntax. And I think I actually might be wrong on what the attribute syntax actually is. I think I've changed my slides earlier to the add operator with the square brackets, but I think it is actually the hash with square brackets. So I'm going to have to unbreak my slides for that. And because they start with a hash, it means that these are already comments in PHP 7. So as long as you have single line comments, using the hash will actually continue to work. So my apologies for showing that the attribute syntax is at square brackets, where it is actually hash square brackets. So again, my apologies for that. All right, Christoph is asking, are there any disadvantages of the JIT engine or cases where that shouldn't be used or enabled, if it is possible to disable? The JIT engine is actually something that you need to enable specifically for now, because it can do things that you might not expect. The disadvantages of it is that it is new code, and new code will have more bugs than old code. And if your benchmark shows that the JIT engine slows things down, then you shouldn't enable it. I don't think there will be very many cases where that happens, but it is possible that in specific applications, turning on the JIT engine slows things down. In that case, you want to turn it off. And the JIT engine is part of opcache, and this is also where you will be able to configure for turning it on or off, or turning on some of the other configuration flags as well. All right, a question by Rod, and he's asking, what are your thoughts on the Rust programming language? First question. I have no thoughts about it because I've never looked at it. And the follow-up question is, do you think it would be beneficial, possible to use Rust to develop, speed up the PHP source code somehow? Well, that is a question I've heard before. And although that might be possible, everything in PHP is currently written in C. Changing that to Rust is asking the PHP developers to rewrite PHP, and asking all the extension developers to also rewrite all of that. So I don't think there's any benefit in this. And unless there's a good interaction and a good APIs between C code there, where you need to be really careful with your memory management yourself, and Rust, where you really don't have to be so careful, like in PHP, I don't see this moving in that direction at all. All right, and then the last question that I currently see is by Kat. She's asking, will Xdebug allow breakpoints on attribute lines? That is a good question. I don't believe it is possible because the PHP engine, after the analyzing and converting to bytecode stage, that code is gone, and instead it will be converted to metadata on these attributes. What of course you can set breakpoints is when you call getInstance or your constructor of your attributes themselves. So that's where you can set a breakpoint, but you can't likely set it on the breakpoint lines because the PHP engine doesn't see any code on there anymore. It is metadata that's going to be attached to your coding elements. Okay, one more. How we're doing on time? Okay, still pretty good. Steve's asking, how can we get more involved with internals? Well, that is a tricky question. It sort of depends on what kind of itch you want to scratch. If you want to make sure that new versions of PHP will work on, sorry, let me rephrase it. New versions of PHP aren't going to break things unexpectedly for already existing applications, test the release candidates. It requires you to build PHP, which is really not that hard, and then run the release candidates with your code. So that is one thing you can do. If you want to make sure that PHP has the argument names correctly, that's the process that we've just done for PHP 8 or is now nearly finished, that would be a fairly simple way of getting involved with internals. If you find that some of the new functionality hasn't been documented properly, that is the way how you can get involved. If you find a bug report, don't go yell out on Twitter that you found a bug in PHP. Find a bug report in a PHP issue tracker with a reproducible case and as much information as you can find out. Or if you don't know how to find out more information, there is a channel on Stack Overflow called Room 11, which I don't remember the link to, but I can give you in a moment. It's a place where lots of PHP internals developers hang out, and you can bounce off these potential bugs at them. Or if you have some spare time, go to the PHP issue tracker, click on the random link. You'll get a random bug. Perhaps that bug doesn't have a reproducible case, so try to reproduce that. If you want to do coding on C itself, you are going to have a bit of a learning curve there because this is C code with lots of macros interspersed. But if you think you found an easy enough bug to in the issue tracker, yeah, go ask people on Room 11, for example, or what would be good places to look at. Sometimes bugs can be an interesting way of learning how a specific thing works. Or another thing would be, is like, if you think you have a good idea for a new feature in PHP, have a look at the RFC process, propose your new feature, interact with other PHP developers first, preferably, before you write the code for that. In some cases, it doesn't always look like features are going to be added to PHP. Now, that might not stop you from still wanting to contribute it yourself, but you can't always expect it being accepted, of course, because that depends on how many people think this feature is useful and whether it is technically feasible, and that isn't always the case either. So there's many things how to get involved with internals, and I've probably forgotten at least as many as I just mentioned. All right. I see no open questions, so I would like to say thank you very much for attending. I will upload the slides later today, or probably tomorrow actually, to the URL that you see here. You can scan this QR code, and this QR code, as you can see, is a lot smaller than the QR code that you need to enter a business at the moment, because I don't encrypt and sign the information in there. It's kind of pointless. If you have further questions, say hello on Twitter, send me an email on derek@php.net. Cat's making a joke saying after you fix the attribute error, that is a really simple fix because I can just call git revert because I haven't even committed it yet. So just removing my local changes will do that for me. Having said that, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you some other time.